Further debate. The member from Lanark, Lennox, Frontenac and Addington.
Getting closer, getting closer. Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington. Very good, Speaker. Speaker, I listened intently and with high expectations to the throne speech as was delivered in this House last week. And as usual, I came prepared with my notebook and pen, taking notes and recording my observations. But while listening to this throne speech, it became apparent that something was very much different and askew. And I began to wonder if I had experienced a very different 2014 general election. For what I had heard in the throne speech bore little resemblance to what I saw and heard from the people in my riding. First off, let me assure all members in the House that although I can be quite critical of the government, I've been equally critical of other parties, including my own, which I regard as a responsibility of all of us in this House to be the public's watchdog. Speaker, this election illustrates a great disservice that happened to the people of Ontario. While our economy sputters and leaves people with fewer and fewer economic opportunities, as a result, we see our sons and daughters leave this province in ever greater numbers each year for greener pastures out west or even to foreign lands. We have increasing difficulties in meeting our social assistance and healthcare commitments for our underemployed and aging population. And people are suffering under skyrocketing electricity costs and the rising cost of living. The cost of doing business in Ontario is a significant hardship to employers and workers alike. But there was very little mention of these real concerns or how they will be remedied by this government in the throne speech. Speaker, we heard loud and clear through this election that while these economic and social ills concern a great number of people we represent, an even greater number of people are frustrated, troubled, and loathing of a government that has exhibited an abundance of administrative incompetence and an immeasurable absence of interest in the oversight and accountability of our public administration. I and many others also heard with clarity the disdain and anger over a government that has treated their tax dollars and the public trust with malfeasance, corruption, and cover-up. But, Premier, you are indeed fortunate. None of these were enough to topple.
From Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington, we'll withdraw that last two comments.
Withdraw.
Continue.
Nonetheless, for reasons that are cause for great introspection on this side of the aisle, the Premier has been given a mandate. However, Speaker, I would respectfully caution and remind the Premier that the mandate she has been given was not solely for her agenda, but a rejection of either of the opposition parties as a ready alternative. So let me now offer the Premier a thoughtful and reasonable response to that unreasonable and fantastical throne speech that we heard. Let me deliver it in this House my commitment to the people of Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington, the people of rural and small town Ontario, and to all the people in Ontario. The Premier said in the throne speech that voters have entrusted your government to be a full and active member in their communities and their lives. I did hear that people wanted to be full and active participants in our democracy, that they needed greater influence in the decisions of government. However, I heard no such clarion call for more government intervention in people's lives. Rather, I heard government was often the largest obstacle to their prosperity, fully 180 degrees apart from the Premier's position. I will therefore retable legislation this session to enable our citizens to remove dishonest or poor-performing politicians through a recall mechanism. I will table legislation to allow for plebiscites and referenda so that people can repeal, amend, or modify your public policies that bring harm and injury to their lives, their businesses, and their communities. I will also bring in legislation into this House so that individuals can bring forward and lodge complaints with the Integrity Commissioner on the conduct of members of this House. That is what the people of Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington told me this election. Speaker, the Premier in the throne speech quotes David Dodge and uses David Dodge as justification to continue the spendthrift ways and the use of the public credit card. I will retable legislation demanding that this House provide a full accounting and estimate of the cost of new legislation and policies of this government, and I will retable amendments to the Taxpayer Protection Act and restrain the unquenchable thirst for public money, regardless if you call them taxes or revenue tools. Once again in the throne speech, and I quote, "The government will continue to manage spending wisely." But remember that quote? Continue to manage spending wisely. You might better have said, your government will start to spend money wisely, or begin to spend money wisely.
Exactly.
That would be more reflective of the experiences of the Ontario taxpayer. Therefore, I'll table legislation this session that will give people tools to command this government to spend money wisely. This includes measures for full and transparent disclosure of government spending, including that of members, agencies, boards and commissions. I will also table legislation that will reform our electoral financing laws so that unions, businesses, and special interest groups and lobbyists will no longer be able to buy, influence, or legislation in this House. This bill will mirror the federal legislation which states individuals must take precedence over organized financial influence in our democracy. The Premier also mentioned Ontario's conservation efforts and clean energy initiatives have moved our province down the road to sustainable energy future. It's a quote from the throne speech. Well, she may think that her government's efforts have led us to sustainability. The reality is that the government's risky green energy schemes have done the exact opposite. Our hydro system is the furthest thing from sustainable, and much of that is a direct outcome of the burden of the Green Energy Act that has placed on our hydro rates and our infrastructure. And yet, instead of recognizing this, like every other voter I met on the campaign trail, you have committed to expanding this disastrous program, ignoring the impact it is having on families' budgets and businesses. That's why I will continue to advocate and fight for the repeal of the Green Energy Act.
Right on.
And will continue to fight every day with every tool in our legislative toolbox to have your government's out-of-control hydro bureaucracy investigated.
Exactly.
Just as we've had with the Ombudsman, who's already looking into Hydro One, and the Auditor General and the investigation into the gas plant fiasco. But Speaker, last but not least from the throne speech, and I quote, "Our Treasury Board President, through action and deed, will lead oversight, accountability with openness and modernization."
There's a Danny.
Another quote.
That's a Danny.
Clap for that one. That announcement that the Treasury Board President will be the former Minister of Health, whose oversight so well protected the taxpayer with Orange and eHealth. That's quite a position and quite a reward. I knew immediately I must table legislation that is consistent with the desires and the expectations of my constituents and of the people of Ontario, and rooted in the fundamentals of a representative democracy. I will table legislation that will create grand juries who will have the expressed authority to investigate and inquire into those actions and deeds and expenditures of all taxpayer-funded ABCs and our provincially owned and operated institutions. Premier, the appetite for reform in this province has been left unsated with this election. The thirst for a truly representative government remains dry and parched. Reforms are needed, they're warranted and justified, not just within your government, but within this Legislative Assembly. In that light, I will also reintroduce my reforms of the standing orders that put constituents first and empower local legislators, putting representation back into representative democracy. In the spirit of fixing what we in this House have allowed to break, I hope I can count on the Premier's full support of my efforts to get Ontario back on track. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The member from Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington has 2 minutes to respond.
Thank you, and thanks to the members from Windsor, Tecumseh, Vaughan, Nepean, Carleton, and London West for their comments. I did keep it with some brevity because I know that the Liberal government at the moment has a lot on their plate, and I didn't want to confuse them with too many things, so I just kept it to a minimum. But that might not always be the case. We could get a little bit long-winded sometime in this chamber. But I do want to respond to the member from Nepean Carleton and the Minister of Transportation, if he cared to listen, because he is so intently listening to people, even the other ministers right at the moment. But the purpose of having 107 members in this Assembly is to hear the concerns from those various localities and the demographics there. So while I would challenge the Minister of Transportation to actually show me one of his constituents that said, continue to spend our money wisely, I'll give that to him, that maybe he did find somebody in his constituency that said that. But more importantly, listen to what other areas have to say, because I'm sure the member from Vaughan doesn't come up to Tatlock very often, and he doesn't go to Verona very often, just as I try not to go to Vaughan very often. So that's our role, is to bring those concerns here, vocalize them, advocate for them, and have an attentive ear on the other side of the House to ensure that those concerns are not lost in this place. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.